Welcome to the Neijiaquan podcast. My name is Isaac Kamens. This is a bi-weekly podcast where my friend Jess O'Brien and I discuss internal martial arts, Qigong, and meditation. This week we discuss the founder of the Yin style of Bagua Zhang, the famous Yin Fu, Thin Yin. We first discuss Yin's early life and his meeting the founder of Bagua Zhang, Neijiaquan. We discuss his early training with Deng, and then eventually how he convinced Deng to teach him Bagua Zhang. And then in our Patreon episode, we continue our discussion on the spiraling energy body, Qigong. We break down how it fits into the 5-element system of Bruce Francis. And we also talk a little bit about how it connects to practicing other things like Bagua Zhang and Tai Chi. I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks for listening and take care.
Welcome to the Neijiaquan podcast with Isaac and Jess. Today we want to discuss the great Bagua Zhang master Yin Fu, who's one of the most important teachers to be part of this lineage. And he's got a great life story. So far, the last few episodes, we've been talking a lot about another branch of Bagua Zhang called the Neijiaquan style. And that's one of the more widespread ones and is a very big influence on what we do. But there's a whole nother side to the story. There's a whole nother half to the Bagua world, so to speak. That's the other most common teacher, which is the Yin Fu style. And Yin Fu was the great master Deng Neijiaquan's first student and sort of the first guy who learned the Bagua system and was part of it while it was being formed. And Isaac, we've been doing Bagua together for many years, and we've talked a lot about the masters that we've learned about. And I think one thing that keeps coming up is like there's somewhere in this 1910s and 1920s area that Bagua is still seen as a single unified martial art. That's just one martial art instead of all the different styles that break apart, like the Neijiaquan style, the Yin Fu style. And we've always been kind of trying to discover what were the teachings that were going on in that time period when this martial art was still pretty unified after the death of the founder. Maybe those first 30 or 40 years after he died, it was still considered one martial art before it broke off into a bunch of branches.
Prior to probably 1910 or something like that, there was one school of Bagua Zhang because the founder was either still alive or had just recently passed. Then, as most martial arts do, after a few years, they developed into different styles, and you got we've talked a little bit about these sort of, there was the South School, the West School, the North, these different schools in Beijing that they sort of divided up into geographical chunks, right? And Yin Fu was the first student, so he claimed to, have the most complete system of the bunch, right? Whereas Neijiaquan was the last student, so he sort of got the essence of the thing in a sort of stripped down package, right? And then there was everything in between with the other guys, right? And stylistically, they may have been a little bit different because of the way Deng taught, which was to take what people already knew and build on that. But the core principles were essentially the same way you would have with Tai Chi, right? You have different styles like, Yang style, Wu style, and the movements look a little different, but the essential practice is the same. Thus, they are the same art, right? And so I think that kind of thing happened here, and it's just like kind of branching out from there, and it just
that natural progression as each generation sort of solidifies their own approach to the teaching, adds
right.
stuff.
Yeah, and then it becomes about trying to sort of canonize your version or your teacher's version more commonly, where you want to say, okay, well, this is how we do it to make yourself different from everyone else, because that's good marketing, right?
So when we were training together, Kumar would always say, and in his book too, he would say, Liu Hongzhi learned from the school where different branches of Deng Neijiaquan school, all the different Bagua teachers would come and visit and train without prejudice of what style they were from. And so Yin Fu students and teachers were mixing with Cheng Tinghua's students and teachers of that style, as well as other groups that were even lesser known. So there's always been this sense that when we're training, that we want to get back to understanding the roots of what makes all the systems work together. Like, what did you hear about that?
Well, that's, I think, where if you will, the stuff that Liu Hongjie learned initially was the Chen Tinghua school from Chen Yolong. And then they're at this sort of place we've talked about, this meeting ground or whatever.
We've been calling it the Southgate School.
Right. This is where members of all Bagua traditions would hang out. And I think it was, like we talked previously about Neijiaquan and guys like that. And so most of those guys were Chen Tinghua, but there were a few guys there who were also Yin Fu students. And so it just kind of, I think, became like a club, like you have jiu-jitsu clubs now, and guys from different schools will show up and they'll teach. And
you have seminars with different lineages come through.
So you just have that sort of, I think also there were probably fewer and fewer places for these guys to meet. And so it just became easier for them to all get together and, stick together rather than split up.
And in our training, we would always sort of unpack the movements, and compared to other styles that we visited and read about and seen, you could look at different pieces of the Bagua we learned and say, wow, that looks like that chain palm of that big, broad dragon palm. But also at other times where there's a more tighter palm with the folded thumb, we'd say maybe that's from Yin Fu, maybe this is from Cheng Tinghua, and try to see which different pieces may have come from which different groups that came through and influenced Leo's teachings and learnings.
The form that Bruce teaches is not a strict, Chen Tinghua form. It has other things in it that are more like the Yin Fu, but its overall flavor, if you will, is the Chen Tinghua style.
Right. It does seem to have that same structure, and the names fit with other Cheng schools and stuff like that. So you can see it's rooted in that. This form comes from a time when there wasn't as much sectarian division between the schools, and it might represent a pure version in some way than others that come later.
Yeah, well, Leo kind of went freely back and forth between Yin Fu and Chen Tinghua guys. So at that time, it was still being taught in that sort of organic, person-to-person way of, you might do it a little bit differently because of your size, or you might do it a little bit differently because you like a certain type of application. And this was all still kind of a primordial ooze of Bagua that was floating around.
It was and it's morphing to fit the situation, because again, we're back in that warlord era at this time. So guys are coming to maybe just improve their combat skill. They may not even care about Bagua. I heard you were good. Help. I'm about to go fight.
And it wasn't just Bagua. This was happening with Tai Chi. This was happening with Xing. This was happening with probably all martial arts, because it was this convergence of, we still needed martial arts, but there were also firearms now. So they became less about battlefield use and more about home protection and bodyguard work, right?
And the chaos of the warlord era, where it's more like civilian martial arts and small group fighting rather than necessarily giant imperial armies. It's all different clans and cliques and groups and gangs fighting each other.
Yeah, and it's still useful to have, like, even now they teach people more, some hand-to-hand combat in the military, because those two things do there are some crossover there.
Definitely need both.
So I think that even when they got to the point of just using guns and not doing martial arts on the battlefield anymore, it was still advantageous to have people who knew how to train.
All right, let's take a look at the life of Yin Fu. So we're going to look at what's printed in Bagua Journal 1993 issue on Yin Fu, which is taken primarily from an interview with Xie Pei Qi of Beijing, who is an old generation practitioner of Yin Fu style. So it says that Yin Fu was born in 1841. When he was young, a series of natural disasters, droughts followed by floods, drove him out of his home village, and he moved to Beijing, where he first learned to be a scissor maker. He began as an apprentice, sharpening knives and scissors for a living. A short while later, he gave up the scissors business and began selling pancakes and fried dough twists. In his early years in Beijing, he picked up the nickname Fried Dough Twist Yin. So that's another great nickname for martial artists. Fried Dough Twist Yin. And then his other nickname, since he was tall and slim, they called him Thin Yin. And that's the one that most of us know of him as. Thin Yin Fu was his nickname. And so eventually he meets the founder of Bagua Zhang, Neijiaquan. And there's a few different tales here of how it happened. But the one that seems to capture most of it is that Yin had grown up learning some other martial arts. And then when he came to Beijing, he'd heard about the great teacher Dong Neijiaquan and was determined to meet him. In an effort to be noticed by Dong, Yin purposely chose his business route near the palace of Prince Su, where Dong Neijiaquan worked. Yin constantly asked people who worked and lived near the palace about him. Dong received word of this persistent young man and eventually agreed to teach him. The story also states that Dong started Yin's training with Lohan Shaolin. This version is documented in several of the written accounts of Yin Fu's life. So it sounds like Lohan Shaolin was one of Dong Neijiaquan's sort of, how would you say, your first martial art to get your basic training and then put you into Bagua Zhang to keep developing you from there. Another one says that he knew snake tongue boxing originally, and that might fit in with that snaky movement of Bagua a little bit. So maybe that was what he had originally known. But the most famous episode here is shortly after Yin arrived in Beijing, he went to the palace to challenge Dong Neijiaquan. This is an alternate story. When Yin met Dong and initiated the challenge, Dong was holding a tobacco pouch in his left hand. Dong stretched out his right hand with the palm facing up and said, "You attack first." Yin squared off with Dong and extended his hand in attack. As soon as Yin's hand met Dong's arm, Dong turned his palm over and pressed on Yin's arm. Yin Fu moved to block up, and when he did, Dong speared straight in and struck him in the mouth with his fingertips, knocking out his two front teeth. Dong never even dropped the tobacco pouch. So that was the challenge match. One punch to the face. Yin knelt and asked Dong to be his teacher. Dong refused. Yin said, "If you do not take me as your student, I will kneel here and die in front of you." At that moment, Prince Su was passing by and observed what was happening. He noticed that Yin was very thin and had a unique look. The prince told Dong, "Please accept this young man as your disciple. I will be the one to make the introduction between teacher and student." At this, Dong accepted Yin as his disciple. So Prince Su just happened to be wandering by and told his employee to take this young man as a student. So, yeah, that sounds pretty good.
Sure.
Prince Su doesn't appear much in the Bagua lore, but he's the one who first hired Dong Neijiaquan to be a bodyguard in the palace. He brought him within the palace. So he's kind of an important figure. And I believe he also trained, but he wasn't known for it. Yeah, he's the patron who made it all possible. Just like our patrons make this possible for us. and in the background supply the material to make this whole thing happen. So I like that story.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. I'll take that. I mean, whatever. I think the takeaway, I mean, is whatever it was, there was some art that either Yin Fu knew before meeting Dong Neijiaquan or was taught from Dong Neijiaquan that was not Bagua Zhang.
Right.
And then that developed later.
Well, the punch in the face thing, they always say that's why Yin Fu wore this giant mustache on his face, so it would cover up the fact he was missing all these teeth. And if you see the picture if you go to our Instagram, you'll see there's only a few existing photos of Yin Fu, but he looks like a very ice cold, menacing sort of he's just thin and upright, and the look on his face is one of disdain. And I don't know, it's not like he's a mean necessarily person, but he just doesn't seem to, he just looks I don't know, how would you put it?
Well, you also, I mean, when you took those pictures back then, you were also sitting for about 10 minutes. So,
right,
yeah,
right.
It wasn't exactly.
You couldn't be grinning that whole time. Yeah. But he's got the look of someone who's been a combat veteran type of there's just an ice cold look in his eyes of someone who doesn't give a fuck about anybody else and is not to be messed with.
Right. There's a certain, like you say, ice cold look there.
I mean, I want to use the word menace, but it's also intimidating. And he doesn't look like a huge, thick, strong guy. You can tell he's slim, but it's just like he'd just slice you up with just a look on his face. So it goes on to next talk about Yin Fus training with Dong Neijiaquan. When he first started, they began with Lohan and other Shaolin arts that Dong was teaching in the palace to the guards, scholars, and eunuchs. So Dong had a daily martial arts class, but it wasn't necessarily Bagua Zhang in those early years. He was teaching guards and scholars and eunuchs who aren't necessarily professional fighters. So he's just giving them, it sounds a lot like he's giving them a good workout so they can build up their arm and leg strength or whatever, but it's not that sort of intricate Bagua Zhang styling that is very difficult for beginners. Bagua moves are pretty complex. So he has this Shaolin and Lohan training that you do first to get your muscles up and get your strength up.
Right. I mean, the story, we'll get into it in a later episode, but, you know, Dong Neijiaquan knew something before he learned Bagua too. Right. So my guess is that whatever he knew before he learned Bagua, he taught to, you know, people.
To Yin Fu and these other folks.
Yeah.
And so just to bring up that idea, there's this whole generation of students of Dong Neijiaquan that history doesn't remember. They were taught inside the palace, and those records have never, maybe they were burned up in Boxer Rebellion or something like that, but that's not something that's part of our Bagua lineages. Most of us that know Bagua, it comes from after Dong Neijiaquan's retirement from being this insider in the palace in Beijing, in the Forbidden City. Once he leaves the palace is when he teaches the most. So there's these years he taught that are kind of dark, like nobody knows exactly what was going on during that time period. And there's not a lot of people today who were from then. The students of Yin Fu will sometimes call their school Imperial Palace Bagua because Yin Fu started during that time period before Bagua had kind of like come out to the public.
Right.
So in the future, we'll probably run across people who were from that time period who only later were revealed to have been involved.
Right. Well, I think that part of that was that if you were let's say some sort of government official, wink, wink, and you learned martial arts, joining a martial art lineage is a step down from being the emperor's guard.
Right. If you're associated with the emperor and these high level people, you don't put your name out there next to a bunch of thugged out martial artists.
It's not even thugged out. It's just a lowering your station in the world, and so they don't generally tend to do that. It's
right. If you're with this upper crust literati or high level generals and stuff like that, being involved with sort of street bodyguard type martial arts is not going to look good on your resume.
You don't see a lot of 5-star generals joining
a boxing gym,
or I was going to say joining to coach Little League. You know,
right.
It's like they want to do something at their level. You know? They don't want
their peers aren't going to respect them being part of this.
Yeah, so I think it's part of politically, it didn't necessarily make any sense for them.
Right. So there's a whole political side to this that is sort of in the shadows.
Where if you're a shop owner like Yin Fu or Chen Tinghua,
right. If you're a glasses repairman,
becoming a lineage holder in a martial art that's a prestige.
Right. A martial art that's associated with the imperial city and the royal family. Like that's giving you a bump up in society.
Yeah.
So the next phase of Yin Fu and Dong Neijiaquan's training is when Master Dong is sent to Mongolia to collect taxes for the prince. So Prince Su says, we need to go collect these back taxes. Yin went along with Dong so that he could continue studying. Other than making rounds to collect taxes and sending the money back to the prince, Dong and Yin did nothing but practice martial arts morning, noon, and night. This job continued for a number of years before the prince summoned them back to the palace. It is during this extended stay in Inner Mongolia that Yin first received instruction in Bagua Zhang. So this is the first moment when Bagua Zhang is officially being taught, and it sounds like Dong has sort of created it, and now he's experimenting with how to teach it by teaching it to Yin Fu, and in a sense, it's developing during that time.
Or who knows? I mean, like, this is that thing of it could have been completely organic to the point of they're out in the woods. And, Yin Fu's pestering him day in and day out to show him something. So finally he says, okay, I'll show you this thing I learned when I was in the mountains. Mm-hmm. And, that he gives him a piece of it. I mean, I can only sort of take parallels from everybody I've ever met. And it's like, generally your teacher doesn't just go, here's the entire system, right? They give you a little bit in the beginning, and you chew on that for a few years, and then you kind of like, come on, man, come on, give me a little bit more. And they give you a little bit more, and you practice and you practice. And it's like, oh, come on, give me a little bit. And I don't think it was any different back then that, Yin Fu had to work for it, and Dong Haichuan was only doling it out, when he felt it was necessary. So there was probably, a 5-10 year period where he was giving him little bits until he finally said, okay, here's the, whole thing.
Right. And another piece of that I'd throw out is, we've talked to some older practitioners who are senior to us who were training with Bruce at the time when he was formulating his system. And the students you have at that time, like Mary or Frank or Cooper, like folks who were there in these 70s, he was trying to figure out how best to teach what he wanted to teach. So he picked different people that while he was in there, in other words, the people you teach influence you as you create this martial art. So Yin Fu is clearly there at the time when he's the experiment for how to teach this stuff, kind of.
That's what I'm saying. I don't even think
exactly.
I doubt he was teaching him forms as much as concepts and maybe some internal practice
through applications.
Exactly. And most likely the circle walking was the primary piece of it, right? Because that seems to be among all of his students, the thing that is,
that's the one thing that's common between all the systems is holding a hand out and walking around that circle.
Right. So I think that we can safely say that some part of this initial training was circle walking, and anyone who's ever done any kind of circle walking knows that isn't something you just kind of snap your fingers and get. It takes years and possibly decades, depending on your coordination,
right?
Get how to do that in a way that you could actually use it in a martial situation,
right?
So,
and some mornings I feel like I'm starting all over again.
Sure, and even if you're good at some other martial art, trying to do Bagua it doesn't necessarily translate. And so I think it again, like I said, I think it was probably just like everybody else, a learning curve with it.
Right, an organic process. I guess I was thinking back to when you and I first started, you were just a beginning teacher, kind of getting your feet under you. So I was one of the people who was kind of your experiment to like, how can I get someone to understand this stuff? What metaphors, what teachings, how do I beat this person to help them get the concepts that are in this?
Yeah, and also, there's a very different thing in terms of like, if I'm teaching somebody one-on-one in a sort of friend type of situation or coworker in Yin Fu's in Yin Fu's case, right? Versus I'm running an official class, right? Like if I'm going to the park with somebody who I like and I'm just going to show them martial arts, that's not the same thing as if you come to my class and I teach you how to do Xingyi, right? Like that's going to be very structured and random. Right. But if you just want to like, hey, Isaac, we've been hanging out. Why don't you show me what this weird Bagua stuff is? I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to show you how to do it. Right. And so I think there's a piece of it where that's what Yin Fu got that people who came later didn't necessarily get, is that he got that one-on-one, I'm going to morph you into what I think you should be kind of thing. And sure, Dong Haichuan was probably changing it. I mean, from everything we've read, he was changing it person to person. So I'm not sure he ever got to the point of this is what I teach. And
there's no final product. He was still working on it.
And I think that's what made back to what we were saying earlier about the before the split, right? This primordial Bagua, if you will. It didn't have a form. It was whatever Dong Haichuan told you to do, right? And then I think that later it kind of morphed into forms, right? Because everybody that talks about, I mean, not everybody, but generally in Bagua, there's a discussion about, things being about change, not about form, right? And that's really the central kind of element of it, right? The way you would say, Tai Chi is about softness or something like that, right? So it's kind of interesting to see how, if you look at these initial, then we'll get into it a little bit later, these initial schools, they were all talking about the same concepts. They would, structure it slightly different, but all the same components would come up because that's the piece that most likely Dong Haichuan is teaching.
That's what Master Dong used to do.
And that's all, like I said, that's the stuff you do in the circle walking, and that's the stuff you do that's more about developing your body and
in the hand-to-hand. When someone does that, sort of not slap down your arm and chop you in the side of the head, I swear that Master Dong must have been doing that, because everyone
the description of what he does to Yin Fu is basically what everybody does. You slap that hand and bam,
drill right to the face, and they have to respond. That's what creates your technique. Is that
cover chop, right?
Right, cover chop. Everybody's got that. And Yin Fu people are obsessed with the drilling of the Chuanzang, the drilling palm, over and over.
Well, you can cover and drill too.
I mean, who isn't though? Everybody loves it, but they must be, because that was the first move their teacher learned.
Also, is again, I think that's the stylistic thing of what they started with, right? If you're doing more striking arts to begin with and you're already conditioned, why not? But if you don't have that skill, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to make that your primary thing.
So it sounds like they then Yin Fu and Dong Haichuan returned to Beijing, and Yin was pretty skilled at that point, so he got a job teaching martial arts in the palace as well.
Bagua begins to form as a entity that people would recognize,
it's an official style.
They were starting to be known as Bagua Zhang people, right?
So it says it is known at this time that Yin was the first student to learn Bagua Zhang from Dong Haichuan. At this point, Yin Fu is an official teacher, so he took on his own disciples, and we'll be touching on them in the next couple of episodes. So the Bagua Zhang journal goes on to sort of break down his career, when he started and how long he trained. But basically, we estimate that Dong and Yin trained together at least 8 to 10 years longer than any other student. So that makes the case that Yin Fu really had something from Dong Haichuan that represents the origin of Bagua. He had the original Bagua system. And I think that Dong Haichuan in his later years, he may have gotten to be an even better teacher and more creative, and was able to teach more in less time, perhaps, or whatever happened. Anyways, Yin Fu can claim that they were sort of the original Bagua system to be taught by Dong. A few years after Dong and Yin returned from Inner Mongolia, they had a falling out. Yin Fu's first wife had died, and he married another woman. At that time in China, it was not considered appropriate for a widower to remarry. Dong was upset with Yin, and the two did not speak to each other for years. They finally reconciled their differences shortly before Dong died. It was this falling out with Yin Fu that caused Dong Haichuan to open up and begin teaching more students. Because he was getting older, he did not think he would be able to spend as much time with one student as he had with Yin, so he decided to teach many students and teach each one a separate piece of his system, so that the entire system could be shared among them after he was gone.
Hey folks, Isaac here. Thanks for listening to the episode. Just a quick reminder to check out the Instagram for images to go along with the episodes. And if you haven't already checked out the Patreon, it's $5 just to get the extended episodes and get the early releases. And it's $10 a month to get the entire archive of everything we have on there, which includes interviews and training sessions and all kinds of good stuff. So check that out if you haven't already. Thanks for your support, and take care of yourself.